Okay, welcome to session 4 for our seminar on biblical chronology. What I'd like to cover with you here, and again this will be fairly brief, is some issues related to Egypt and the Old Testament. Egypt had a lot of interaction with various parts of the biblical text, beginning all the way back with Abraham, who went down there and interacted with a king, to Joseph. Of course, the entire sojourn took place down there. Inquiring minds want to know what period was that in Egyptian history. And I will be able to answer some of that for you, but not everything. So let's jump in. If we look at the long history of Egypt, we can divide it into sections. Your typical Egyptologist will divide it this way. We have kingdoms, and those are the bright green sections. We have an old kingdom, a middle kingdom, and a new kingdom. And those are separated by times of turbulence known as intermediate periods. And we have a first, a second, and a third, and those are abbreviated here by FIP, first intermediate period, SIP, second intermediate period, TIP, third intermediate period, because I couldn't get all that text into the box. Okay, this is preceded by what we would call a pre-dynastic period or early dynastic period. It's followed by the late period, and finally the Ptolemaic and Roman period. We subdivide each of these periods into dynasties, and a dynasty is typically genetic succession: father, son, brother, uncle, wife, a string of rulers that are all related to each other. We do, in some of these intermediate periods, have multiple dynasties going on at the same time. There are periods of unrest, periods of difficulty. Often the historical data we have from the intermediate periods is mixed, uncertain, missing information, relatively somewhat unreliable. So those are more difficult times to lay out, and Egyptologists argue over how they should be laid out. The chronology here is pretty solid, back to about 1000 BC. There's not more variance than maybe a decade at that point. By 1500 BC, there's a variance of about 50 years. So estimates vary on the assignment of dates to the kings by about 50 years. And by the time we're back as far as 2000, estimates vary by a good century. Now again, we would place Abraham at about that time, roughly speaking, 2000 BC. So if our estimates of the dates of Egyptian kings at that point varies by as much as a century, you understand suddenly why it's difficult to say this was the king Abraham talked to. Because we're not completely sure which king was ruling at any given point. It varies depending on the chronological system, the Egyptologist that you follow. Dates for the early periods, the pre-dynastic and the early dynastic, those are just educated guesses. I would observe that the more data we get, the more compressed these periods are becoming, the shorter they are becoming. If you go back from today, if you go back a century and look at the estimates that Egyptologists assigned to these periods, especially the early ones, they were guessing, and they guessed long. Now again, I would submit to you that they were trying to fill in the gap between the Egyptians and the monkeys. and they felt the need to stretch it. As we have gathered more and more actual data, these periods have begun to shorten up, to tighten up, to close, because we realize we overestimated how long, especially the early periods, were. That's a trend that it'll be interesting to watch and see if that continues and to what point. By the way, the same thing is true in Mesopotamian history. The early estimates for the earlier periods were quite long, and as we have gathered more and more data, they are all trending shorter and shorter. You have this on your handout from the previous session. Well, this is the beginning, the top part of the Egyptian section on that handout. And it shows you roughly where the patriarchs can be situated in Egyptian history. Again, the dates for Egypt here follow Baines and Malik, which tends to be a shorter chronology, but I didn't just make the dates up. They are taken from that work. That would place Abraham toward the end of the 11th dynasty, Abraham and Isaac. So when he went down to Egypt, do you remember the Pharaoh saw his wife and wanted her, and Abraham said, "Oh yeah, she's my sister. You can have her." What Pharaoh was that? Well, probably one of these guys. Mentuhotep or Mentuhotep or Inyotep. Dynastic titles, and so they tend to have the same name, and we've assigned them numbers. They had secondary names as well that help to distinguish them, but probably one of those guys. By the time of Joseph, it's pretty certain we have entered the 12th dynasty. The 12th dynasty is part of the Middle Kingdom, and it was a time of great Egyptian strength, especially the 12th dynasty, the end of the 11th dynasty too. So Joseph was taken down to Egypt at a time when Egypt was quite strong. There was not a lot of civil war or infighting, or they weren't being pestered so much by their neighbors. If Baines and Malik have correct dates here, then we could probably assign the Pharaoh to whom Joseph spoke as Sesostris the first. It's a little difficult to tell here who all interacted with who, and we're not necessarily told in the text when the kings changed, but I'd be pretty comfortable placing Joseph in the 12th dynasty of Egypt. So we have shifted down now past the second intermediate period, which was the Hyksos period, and come now to the time of the 18th dynasty. These dates are likely correct within about a decade. So like the very first king shown here, Ahmose, those dates are probably correct within, give or take 10 years. So we could probably then assign Moses his birth to sometime in the rule of Thutmose the first. Again, I'm not comfortable saying that with absolute certainty because I'm not 100% certain of the dates of the Egyptian kings. Egyptologists are still arguing about that. But Thutmose the first would not be far off. If this is correct, the Exodus would have taken place during the reign of Thutmose the third. And then Joshua and the conquest during the time of Thutmose the fourth. Those are at least going to be roughly correct. Probably give or take a ruler. By the way, if you look at the numbers on the left side there for their reigns, you'll see some numbers in brackets, like Thutmose III, 1479 to 1425, and then in brackets 22. Those are co-regencies. So he reigned 22 years at the same time as Queen Hatshepsut. Their reigns overlapped. Thutmose III was a kid. Hatshepsut was on the throne as an adult, and eventually he displaced her. But so that's why you'll see those numbers there in the margin. You'll also notice here that we have some inscriptions, two that mention Israel, two that mention the Shasu of Yahweh. And these I want to spend just a little bit of time on with you because I think they're important. I remember being asked probably almost 25 years ago, what's the evidence, the archaeological evidence out of Egypt for the Israelites ever being there? And at the time, the Merneptah stela was considered the earliest reference to Israel in existence, and it dates to about 1210 BC, which is kind of late. Obviously, after the Exodus, that's when the Israelites are living in the land of Israel, in the Holy Land. But since that time, several rather important inscriptions have surfaced. Some of these were known earlier than that, and I was aware of them, and some of them, well, the oldest one in particular, has just much more recently been deciphered. So I'd like to talk with you about those just a bit. We'll come back to the later period here. So this is the latest one, the most recent, the latest in time, the Merneptah stela. You can tell it's a fairly large stela. It was created under the reign of Merneptah in the late 13th century, and it makes a reference, a very well-known reference to Israel. You can see it on this photo. It's down toward the bottom. It's the darker area that's been highlighted. What it says, it names Israel and says of this people group that this people group has been wasted and that their seed no longer exists. It's a typical "we conquered you" kind of statement. So Merneptah is claiming here to have conquered ancient Israel. Just in case you're wondering, so in this glorious computer age, it's difficult to reverse your letters and type in the opposite direction. Now we've overcome that with Unicode. Now we're able to type backwards, as it were, in Hebrew, right to left. Egyptian could be written left to right, right to left, top to bottom, or bottom to top. And we have not mastered doing that yet with the computer, unless you're going to place each individual sign. What I'm getting at here is what you see in the inscription is backward of what you see in the typeface. But once you know that, you can actually make out the letters. So the two read signs in the printed inscription are at the far left. In the actual inscription, they're at the far right. So they're running in opposite directions of each other. If it helps, when you're reading Egyptian signs, you always read into the faces. And so you'll see in the upper register, the faces are looking toward the right, so you would read into them and read to the left. And the typewritten down below is the opposite direction. Okay, so that's late 13th century, and no one denies that, and that's been around for quite a while. That's an early reference to Israel. We have, in addition to that, two inscriptions that make reference to a group of people called the Shasu of Yahweh. We have one at the Temple of Amun-Re at Soleb, which is down in modern-day Sudan. This is a satellite picture of that temple. And this is the actual inscription itself. And if I overlay the signs on top of it, you can kind of see them. It's a little broken off at the edge, but enough is there that you can read it. Michael Astor said this about it. It owes this distinction to the fact that its hieroglyphic rendering corresponds very precisely to the Hebrew tetragrammaton, Yahweh, and it antedates the hitherto oldest occurrence of that divine name, which is on the Moabite stone, by over 500 years. I guess I haven't told you yet. Shasu is an Egyptian term that refers to a nomadic, Bedouin-like people group. So they refer to the Shasu. It's almost like a tribal, nomadic group. So here, the references to the Shasu, this tribal group of Yahweh, a tribal group that apparently worshipped that particular God. And of course, we know that as the name of the God of Israel. Donald Redford said this about it: for half a century, it's been generally admitted that we have here the tetragrammaton, that's the divine name Yahweh. And if this is the case, as it undoubtedly is, the passage constitutes a most precious indication of the whereabouts during the late 15th century BC of an enclave revering this God. Fascinating. Late 15th century BC. And he says they're not an Egyptian group. They're not in Egypt. They're not a subset of the Egyptians. These are foreigners outside of the land of Egypt. Late 15th century, so that's late 1400s. And according to the traditional biblical chronology, the Exodus happened in 1445. So this would be during that period when the Israelites are wandering in the desert. And the Egyptian inscriptions refer to them as the Bedouin-like people of Yahweh. Perhaps the earliest inscription that we have now is Berlin Museum number 21687. We need to come up with a better name for that thing. The Berlin Israel Museum inscription, something like that. It has 3 name rings, and you can see that each name ring forms the body of a captive. That's Egyptian speak telling you these are people we have conquered. They've got their arms tied very awkwardly behind their back, and they've got a rope around their neck. The first 2 are quite clear. They are Ashkelon and Canaan. And then the third one is partially broken, but I think that there's enough there that it can be quite accurately reconstructed as the name Israel. This is Peter Vanderveen is the guy you're looking at in the photo there. He's done a lot of work on this. He wasn't the one that discovered it, but he's done quite a bit of work and published on it, and I'm really grateful to him for some of the data he shared. The little picture up above comes out of the archive of the Berlin Museum, and it's a drawing that they had of it prior to anybody connecting it to Israel. Kind of an interesting little piece. So here is that inscription. The first 2 quite well preserved, and then the third one that actually names Israel. We're missing a good part of the falcon, but you can see if I go back, you can see the beak, the tip of his beak up there, as well as a foot. We've got the lily pool down below, and then the mouth sign down at the bottom. And it spells out Israel. If you're curious, there's actually now been quite a bit of material published on this. Shouldn't be too hard to find if you want to. There's discussion about the signs and the sounds that they make and that kind of thing. But that one is dated to about the end of the 14th century. Amenhotep II. It was discovered, shipped to the Berlin Museum. Nobody knew what it said. We don't even know for sure where it came from, what part of Egypt. It would be fun to have more context on it, but just going by the way words are stated in it, the other two name rings, and by the shape of the characters, they date it to possibly about 1400, the date of Amenhotep II. It's hard to nail down with absolute precision. But that is the earliest reference to Israel anywhere outside of the Bible. So quite a fascinating piece. And so we can now say, no, the Merneptah Stela is not the earliest. We have quite a bit of earlier stuff, both the inscriptions naming the Shasu of Yahweh. The Amara inscription is actually a copy of the one at Soleb. Seti I just took everything that Amenhotep had put as places he had conquered and just copied it verbatim at Amara. But the Soleb inscription is the original, and that's mid 14th century. So, yeah, some really fun stuff there. We could, if we had time, go on. There continues to be interaction between Israel and Egypt. Solomon marries an Egyptian princess. Hezekiah gets help from Tirhaka, a Nubian Egyptian king. We even see some Egyptian interaction in later books, but they're not really contested, and so I don't want to spend much more time on them. You can look that stuff up at your leisure. And with that, I think we'll move on to Lesson 5.